Dear students, welcome to Massive Open Online course on Research Methodology in History. Today we shall be speaking on Nationalist Historiography in India. When we talk about nationalist historiography or nationalist historians, we can say that this school has emerged as a reaction to colonial or imperialist history writing in India. Often, nationalist historiography and national historians are the terms used in comparative sense in contrast to the colonial or imperialist historiography and historians. Filled with legitimate national pride, a rising generation of Indian scholars sought to vindicate their natural culture against unfounded changes or interpretations by the European writers. So the historians who belong to this school actually fall under this category. Though there have been occasional lapses of the true principles of historical reconstruction, the terms in question should not be taken to mean a body of writers or writings whose sole objective was the glorification of India's past. R.C. Majumdar restricts the term nationalist historians to those Indians who, in constructing their country's history, aimed at re-examining or examining India's past. The nationalist approach to Indian history may be described as that trend of Indian history that tends to contribute in the growth of nationalist feeling and to unify in the face of religions, caste, linguistic differences, or class differentiation. Initially, the nationalist historians followed the pattern of historical exploration, like the colonialist historians, and wrote about India either as a whole or of Indian rulers who ruled different parts of India with emphasis on their religion or caste or linguistic affiliation. But as the colonial historical narrative took a negative view about India's political and social development, there appeared a nationalist reaction by Indian historians who came with counter-arguments to the justificatory view of colonialism. So this is what I was saying, that colonial historiography actually received some kind of counter from the nationalist historians, or in other words, you can say that the nationalist historiography emerged as a protest, as an opposition to colonial or imperialist history writing. As the colonial historians set certain stereotypes about India's past, India's society, and Indian culture, we find that the Indian nationalist historians, they also framed certain stereotypes. Certainly here in this context, the stereotypes were positive in character. So they framed certain positive stereotypes that opposed colonial allegations about India. Thus, the nationalist historiography developed to oppose and confront colonial historiography as an effort to build the national self-respect in the face of constant colonial denigration of Indian people, their culture, and their historical records. We find that many Indians affected by nationalism, they took up examination of colonial stereotypes about India, and they considered that they should challenge the viewpoints expressed or highlighted by the colonial historians. Thus, the nationalist history writing in India came up as a challenge to colonial or imperial history writing. Indian historians tried to prove the falsity of colonial historical narratives based on analysis of existing historical sources. the nationalist historians proclaimed that the colonial notion of India's tradition of spirituality as a mark of distinction and of India's greatness and superiority over the West, especially in terms of moral values as compared to the essentially materialistic culture of Western civilization. The nationalist historians stressed on the prowess of the Indians in administration, in statecraft, in empire building, in diplomacy, in taxation structure, and in military organization, warfare, agrarian, industrial, and commercial development. So these were the aspects where we find that the colonial or the imperialist historians had undermined the capabilities of the Indian rulers and Indian culture, forms of government, etc. So we find that in those areas which were actually brought under denigration, those areas of India's past which were brought under denigration by the colonial or imperialist historian were actually countered by the nationalist historians. They vehemently denied the notion of ancient India being inefficient in running a state. We find in the writings of colonial historians that India lacked statecraft. Indian governments were autocratic in character, and the forms of despotism that existed in India, those were of primitive and very backward kind of. As a result of which, India had an underdeveloped society, economy, culture. In every way, India was underdeveloped because of this. So these particular statements were countered or opposed by the nationalist historians, who said that this is a very wrong notion or incorrect notion that India was inefficient in running a state. The nationalist historians denied the dominant influence of religion on the state and asserted later's secular structure, secular character, we can say. We find that in the writings of the nationalist historians, it have been pointed out that India's statecraft or state building was influenced by religion. But we find that the nationalist historians very overtly, they point out that India had a secular society since ancient times. They also contradicted the view that the ancient Indian culture was autocratic and despotic, and mentioned that some of the ancient Indian states had democratic character too, and some of the those states which were democratic in character had limitations over aristocracy, and there was emphasis on public opinion. Some nationalist historians even argue that Indian monarchies often approached constitutional monarchies. So thus we find that the Mantri Parishad that existed in India, and as mentioned by Kautilya in his Arthashastra, has been compared with Privy Council of Britain. So these kind of interpretations we find among the writings of nationalist historians. The nationalist historians point out that Indian monarchies were quite near or similar to constitutional monarchies. So therefore, the framing of the notion by the colonialist historians that India lacked statecraft, that was not acceptable. We find that in the writings of nationalist historians, emphasis have been laid on the existence of local self-government in ancient India. We find that works have been done on democratically elected village panchayats, which existed in ancient India. Some of the writers have spoken about popular assemblies, parliaments, and cabinet system. As they pointed out that under Chandragupta, in medieval India under Akbar and Shivaji, this popular assemblies, parliaments, and cabinet systems were in existence. So, some writers also point out that the Indian rulers observed the international law by the rulers, by other rulers during wars. So, respect for international law could also be found in Indian among the Indian rulers. This particular idea have been put forward by nationalist historians. The nationalist historians deny the charge that the Indian rulers took recourse to arbitrary taxation. So we find that in the writings of colonial or imperialist historians, this aspect of arbitrary taxation by the rulers of India have been mentioned. So this particular aspect have been countered by the by the nationalist historians, and they argued that a taxation system existed in India which was virtually akin to the modern system of taxation that prevailed during the British period. So they said that the taxation system in ancient India or in medieval India were also quite up to date and progressive in nature. R.C. Majumdar wrote in his Corporate Life in Ancient India that institutions which we are accustomed to look upon as of Western growth had also flourished in India long ago. So R.C. Majumdar pointed out, R.C. Majumdar was a noteworthy nationalist historian. He pointed out that whatever some of the institutions which are considered as the outcome of Western civilization, in ancient India, many institutions similar to these institutions had existed long back, even prior to the Western civilization. So this particular statement has been made by R.C. Majumdar. And the nationalist historians on medieval India, they pointed out, they repeated the entire nationalist approach towards ancient Indian history, and they emphasized on the development of a composite culture in northern India as a result of interaction among Hindus and Muslims, but at the level of common people and the elite class. So we find that there's emphasis on composite culture have been mentioned by nationalist historians who wrote on medieval India. So in ancient India, the presence of secular culture we have already spoken about. That is, religion was not the guiding factor in state machinery because India had different types of population. India, since ancient time, has been a mosaic of multiculture, multi-language, and multi-ethnicity. So this particular composition was present in India even before, even during the ancient times. So this particular aspect, we find that even those nationalist historians who wrote on medieval India, they had pointed out, they had highlighted. They said that in northern India, we find a development of composite culture. And this composite culture had emerged as a result of interaction between the Hindus and the Muslims at various levels. Many nationalist historians tried to show how a small trading company, like I'm talking about the nationalist historians who wrote about the late medieval period. We find that these nationalist historians, they tried to trace how a small trading company backed by a small country thousands of miles away conquered such a large country like India, a country which had great civilization, which had a great past. So how a small trading company conquered such a huge territory. The nationalist historian tried to seek answers to this question through their writings. The contemporary nationalist critic of colonialism was also the first step taken towards economic history of pre-colonial India. So we find that with the writings of nationalist historians. Economic history of pre-colonial India was one of the major genres of history that emerged. This provided national awareness during the Indian national movement and contributed in converting it into a mass movement. So, mass movement here, I would say by the late 1930s, by the 1930s, when the role of the common people in history began to gain importance. So, we find that the writings of the nationalist historians about ancient India, some writings about medieval India, did play an important role in generating consciousness among the people during the national movement. I am talking about Indian national movement, where we find that even the contribution of the common people have been given importance. Now, when we talk about nationalist historians, we find a number of historians have contributed to this sphere of history writing. Nationalist historiography mainly flourished with the writings about ancient and medieval periods. But we find that the nationalist historians have hardly written about modern period in Indian history. The nationalist writings on modern India came up after 1947, and thus we find that thus we can assume, I would say, that a history of national movement or colonial economy from nationalist perspective did not exist before 1947. Now, when we talk about nationalist historians, we find that several national historians with their individual perspectives have contributed or enriched the arena of nationalist historiography in India. A detailed and scientific critique of colonialism was developed in the last quarter of the 19th century by non-academic nationalist economists like Dadabhai Naoroji, Justice Ranade, G.V. Joshi, R.C. Dutt, K.T. Telang, G.K. Gokhale, and G.K. Gokhale and D.E. Vacha. So these were people who made a scientific criticism of colonialism. And they criticized colonialism in India from economic perspective. So they were the initial group of scholars who contributed to the nationalist school of history writing. Some other economists, national economists who contributed to this sphere of study included K.T. Shah, K.T. Shah, V.C. Kale, and C.N. Vakil. Then we find that by the first half of the 20th century, another category of nationalist historians emerged. Who were they? Gadgil, Gyanchand, V.K.R.V. Rao, Wadia, and Marchant. These people followed the footsteps of the nationalist economic historians, and we find that they came up with their contributions in the first half of the 20th century. Their criticism about colonialism in India formed the core of the national movement after 1920. National movement in India, I would say, after 1920. However, some nationalist leaders also contributed to history writing connected to the national movement. Now here see that some nationalist leaders also contributed. Here I am saying that under the nationalist school, we find that even some nationalist leaders could be considered as historians. Who were they? R.G. Pradhan, A.C. Majumdar, Jawaharlal Nehru, Pattabhi Sitaramaiah. These people were leaders in the Indian national movement, and they, through their writings, have significantly enriched the arena of nationalist historiography in India, and their writings illuminate us about the Indian national movement. Post 1947 historians of historians belonging to the school, they accepted the legitimacy of nationalism and the Indian national movement. But we find that they seldom dealt with the foundation in the economic critique of colonialism. Modern historians under this category have been divided between such as Tara Chand, who held that India has been a nation in the making since the 19th century, and those who argue that India has been a nation since the ancient times. So these two categorizations we find among the nationalist historians. Now, when we speak about the nationalist historians, some of the important names we should take. One of the initial contributors in the sphere of writing was R.G. Bhandarkar. R.G. Bhandarkar was the first Indian historian to apply critical and analytical principles to the writing of history, to utilize different kinds of sources after thorough scrutiny, to deduce logical and scientific conclusions from the data while writing. And he was a versatile genius whose grasp over Sanskrit and Prakrit language was amazing, and whose knowledge of philosophy and religion was also very profound. Bhandarkar was a thinker at his own right. He was eager to bring about social and religious change, as he believed that many of the orthodox customs of his day had no foundation in ancient Hindu religion. So here you see that although he was a person, he was a person who was greatly interested in religion, but he wanted to interpret religion from a scientific perspective. He said that many of the orthodox customs, as I have mentioned just now, orthodox customs that existed in the Indian society does not have or did not have any root in the original Hindu religion. He was the first Indian scholar to apply Western techniques and methods to the study of Sanskrit and Indian antiquities, and he was the first to judge the Oriental values with Occidental standards. So thus we find that the contribution of R.G. Bhandarkar had been enormous. His important works included The Early History of Deccan and A Peep into the Early History of India. Bhandarkar did not express anti-British feelings in his writing. So although he talked about ancient India, he tried to counter the viewpoints of the colonialist historians, but any open criticism against the British cannot be found or are not found in his writings. On the other hand, we find that he was a fond admirer of Britain, of Germany, and he was perhaps the first historian, Indian historian, to apply Rankian method to Indian problems. He believed that nothing but dry truth should be the object behind writing of history. And despite his deep religious bent of mind, we find that Bhandarkar never allowed religious views to influence his ideas of historical evolution. He never believed in the divine will as the determining factor of history. Next, we shall speak about another great historian belonging to this school. He was Hemchandra Roy Choudhury. Hemchandra Roy Choudhury expanded the frontiers of knowledge in ancient Indian history right up to the 9th century by reconstructing history beyond the time of Alexander. So Professor Hemchandra Roy Choudhury was the epitome of the spirit of Bengal Renaissance, which created several milestones in the field of ancient Indian literature, philosophy, history, science, and subsequently led to the growth of Indological consciousness among the Indians, I would say. The greatest contribution made by Hemchandra Roy Choudhury included his many work like The Political History of ancient India from the accession of the Prakrit to the extinction of the Gupta dynasty can be considered as one of his magnum opus. This was a daunting task of Professor Roy Chaudhuri, who constructed the pre-Bimbisara period to ancient Indian history based on a careful analysis of ancient Indian literary traditions, which according to him contained genuine historical documents. So he was that historian who reconstructed the history of India beyond the time of Alexander. He went through the entire Vedic and epic Purana literatures and various other Sanskrit and Prakrit texts as well as Buddhist texts in order to form his arguments or in order to reconstruct the period prior to the coming of Alexander. From his research and reconstruction of ancient Indian history from the 9th century BC to the extinction of the Gupta dynasty, Professor Roy Chaudhuri arrived at his original theme of how kingdoms in ancient India transcended provincial lines and how they were subjected to a struggle between what was called centripetal and centrifugal force. Now, when we talk about centripetal and centrifugal force, let me here elaborate a bit. Centrifugal force can be referred as that force which move or tend to move away from the center. While on the other hand, centripetal force included a force or refers to a force that makes a body follow a curved path. So he mentioned that in Indian society, centripetal and centrifugal force existed that denied the trajectory of formation of ancient Indian kingdoms. Professor Roy Chaudhuri, while evaluating the achievements of Ashoka, Emperor Ashoka in detail, he had criticized Ashoka's Dhamma Vijaya, which according to him was a centripetal force. And to him, Ashoka turned civil administration into religious propagandist. He also wrote, under quote I would say, when India needed men of caliber of Chandragupta and Puru, she got a dreamer. Magadha, after the Kalinga war, frittered away her conquering energy in attempting a religious revolution. The result was politically disastrous. The second work of Professor Roy Chaudhuri was Materials for the Study of Early History of the Vaishnava Sect. Next, let us speak about Jadunath Sarkar. Jadunath Sarkar was one of the most important historians belonging to this school. He regarded the pre-Mughal Sultanate period as one of darkness and considered Akbar as responsible for bringing about new civilizing light in the art, in administration, in law and order. Jadunath Sarkar had praised Akbar but chose Aurangzeb for his first major work and tried to show that the fall of the Mughal Empire in India was because of its own internal weaknesses. However, he remained silent about the role of the British in it. It was only after the Battle of Plassey that he heralded the English victory as the harbinger of new Renaissance in India. Though he did not specifically oppose racial and communal basis of such periodization as James Mill made. James Mill periodized India on the basis of religion, but foresaw difficulties in periods overlapping each other. One of the methodologies of Jadunath Sarkar was his insistence on evidences while writing history. He took great pain to get documents in different languages to establish facts. And we find that he established facts of mostly political and military character. And as a result of which, we find that Jadunath Sarkar could come up with very important historical texts like Akhrabat from Jaipur, Baharistan-hi Gyabi, Haft Anjuman. Among these were some of the documents which he could rediscover. To Jadunath Sarkar, the contemporary English correspondence, for example, the Pune residency correspondence, were more important since they revealed the details lacking in Indian documents like Sanskrit poems, Maratha documents, and Bakhar literature. In his work on the battles, Jadunath Sarkar would take great pain to describe troop movements and to identify the exact spots. He would take trouble of visiting the spots again and again. His historical works could be divided into two major types. In the first category, we find that History of Aurangzeb. In 5 volumes, it was written. 1912 to 1958, Shivaji and his times, then Mughal administration, later Mughals, fall of the Mughal Empire, and the military history of India. Jadunath Sarkar's Aurangzeb and Shivaji narrated the history of the 17th century around 2 individuals, while his later Mughals, these are the name of the books, later Mughals, fall of the Mughal Empire, dealt with the personalities and events of the 18th century. His work on Aurangzeb traced the fall of the Mughal Empire, and his work on Shivaji, in contrast, discussed about the rise of a nation under a heroic leader. Jadunath Sarkar, he dealt with the decline of the Mughals. While dealing with the decline of the Mughals, we find that he did not go into details about the downfall of the Marathas or the rise of the English. And discussions on these particular aspects were kept in the background. So it becomes quite clear from his narrative of the fall, on the fall of Nawab Siraj-ud-Daulah in Bengal in 1957, where the internal weaknesses of the Nizamate and the weak character of the Nawab had been painted in detail by collecting information from Persian sources written under British initiatives. 19th and 20th century Maratha nationalism had no impact on Shivaji, according to Jadunath Sarkar. He believed in the presence of mixed culture of Indian society, but affirmed that it existed in a limited way in Indian society, as the exchanges between the Hindus and the Muslims had occurred at the lower level and among the lower classes. And he also pointed out, one of his important work was the history of Bengal. We find that in his History of Bengal, Volume 2, Jadunath Sarkar seemed to believe that the English had rescued the Bengalis from oblivion, from darkness, and a kind of reverse nationalism which did not look into the colonial policies of the British could be found in his writings, in this particular writing. Sir Jadunath Sarkar believed that although English as a language was indispensable, the importance of Indian languages also could not be ignored. He stressed the importance of secondary education and laid a very strong emphasis on independent writing and wanted India to create within herself a source of highest original research and assume her right position in the school of Asia. The other important historians who wrote on ancient India were Ramesh Chandra Dutt, K.P. Jaiswal, Radha Kumud Mukherjee, S. Krishnaswamy Iyengar, amongst others. Though nationalist work on medieval India were comparatively lesser, but we find important historians, nationalist historians belonging to this genre also, like Muhammad Habib, K.M. Ashraf, Muhammad Azim, Istiaq Hussain Qureshi, Zahiruddin Faruqi were among some of them. Some other historians contributed to modern Muslim historiography on medieval India. They were Surendranath Sen, Sardar K.M. Panikar, K.A. Nilkantha Shastri, and R.C. Majumdar. The contributions of R.C. Majumdar included works both on ancient and medieval India with concentration on the culture, on the history and culture of Indian people. So when we talk about the characteristics of nationalist historiography in India, we find that the nationalist historians, they set up a high tradition of historical scholarship, number one. Number two, they highlighted the multilingual, multi-religious, multi-ethnic and multicultural character of the Indian society. Number three, they carefully and meticulously footnoted all their statements, and hence their writings were often empirically sound. Their research advanced our understanding and interpretation about India's past. The nationalist historians have contributed to the cultural defense against colonization of Indian culture, and most of their work contributed about positive impact of modernization in our society, uncovered new sources, and developed new framework of the interpretation of existing sources. They raised new questions. They produced controversies, initiated active debates, and inculcated notion of historical research among the Indians from indigenous perspective. And we find that the nationalist historians spoke about self-confidence, self-assertion, and they talked about national pride, which enabled Indian people to struggle against colonialism during Indian national movement. Neelkanta Shastri and other historians helped us to overcome the regional bias, the bias of treating India as a coterminous to Indian Gangetic Basin. Thus, the nationalist historiography played an important role in unifying India, you would say. The historians did detailed and meticulous research, which had created excellent traditions of devotion of facts and details. But there were certain demerits also, which we cannot ignore. Number one, the nationalist historians, they have underplayed inner contradictions of Indian society based on class and caste and oppression and discrimination against women and tribes. They seldom spoke about in-depth analysis of Indian national movement and indulged in blind glorification of India's past. Then we find that while adopting a secular position and condemning communalism, they have not made a serious analysis of its characters or elements, causation and development. Thus, the historians have neglected economic, social and cultural history, and this was a major lacuna. They suffered from an upper caste and male chauvinist cultural and social bias and tended to accept the theory of Indian exceptionalism that Indian historical development faced. They missed historical evaluation of Indian social institutions while proving India's superiority in historical development. They accepted James Mill periodization of history as Hindu and Muslim period. So these were the major lacuna which we find that nationalist historiography had. But despite that, we cannot ignore the contributions of the nationalist historians. They did play an important role in framing a national scholarship about India from indigenous perspective, and thus protected or defended Indian history from the attacks of the colonialist historians. So with this, I come to an end to my lecture. Thank you.